The first drop of blood hit Zara Banks's crisp white cafe, name tag at exactly 5:52 a.m. A jarring crimson stain against the bright blue fabric of a uniform she had meticulously ironed just 4 hours ago. Zara froze, her worn sneakers squeaking against the damp pavement of the alley as she pulled out an earbud, the rhythm of her podcast dying away to be replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. She was already 10 minutes late for her opening shift at the corner diner, and Rosie, her manager, had made it clear. One more strike and she'd be job hunting. With a bank account sitting at exactly $1,847 and a $1,400 rent payment due in 5 days, Zara knew she should keep walking. She had $447 left to cover gas, her phone bill, and the student loan payment she'd already deferred twice. In this part of the city, survival meant minding your own business, a lesson she'd learned at 12, watching shadows dance during a shooting, and spending the next month terrified the darkness would come back for her. But the sound from beneath the heavy metal maintenance grate at the mouth of the alley was impossible to ignore. It wasn't the wind or the comforting rumble of the freeway. It was a human plea, raw and distorted by a level of agony that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Help," the voice rasped, barely a whisper before it was cut off by a wet, meaty thud. Zara's thumb trembled over the 911 icon on her phone. Every instinct told her that calling the cops would mean a statement, a lost job, and a target on her back. This was professional, gang-related, and definitely not her problem. Walk away, she told herself. Pour the coffee. Collect your tips. Forget this. But Zara was more stubborn than she was smart. Her mama always said she'd inherited her daddy's hero complex along with his high cheekbones. Her father had died pulling a stranger from a burning car when she was 6, and Zara still remembered the way he ran toward danger instead of away from it. "This is insane," she whispered, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She pocketed her phone, gripped the rusted iron of the maintenance grate, and pulled. The metal groaned in a shrieking protest that echoed off the brick walls like a gunshot. As it gave way, a thick, nauseating smell of rust, mildew, and decay wafted up from the gloom. Zara clicked on her flashlight and descended into the throat of the city. Below, the screaming had stopped, replaced by rapid, angry Korean and the casual laughter of men who were enjoying their work. She killed her light, pressing herself against a cold stone pillar as she peered into the basement. Under a single hanging bulb, 4 men in dark suits stood smoking cigarettes, their holstered weapons visible at their hips. They were guarding a heavy metal door, behind which came the sound of labored, wet breathing. Zara felt around until her fingers closed over a chunk of broken concrete. It was a suicide mission, but it was all she had. She took a breath and hurled the concrete at a cluster of metal pipes. The resulting clang was deafening. As the men drew their weapons and moved toward the noise, Zara ran low and fast for the door. She threw the latch and slammed the bolt home just as the first gunshot shattered the silence outside. In the flickering light, she saw him, Baek Do-yeon. He was chained to a structural pillar, his white shirt soaked in blood and his wrists raw where the heavy shackles bit into his skin. He looked like a fallen king, staring at her with one good eye in total shock. "Run," he rasped. "They will kill you." Zara dropped to her knees, pulling a piece of rebar from the debris. "Then I guess we better work fast." Zara Banks just traded her $1,400 rent and her safety for a man she doesn't even know. Would you have pulled that grate open, or would you have kept walking to work? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe now to find out if she survives the next 10 minutes. The heavy iron grate surrendered with a groan that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the city, and Zara slipped into the mouth of the maintenance tunnel. The air down here was different. It was thick, stagnant, and tasted of ancient rust and damp concrete. Each step down the rusted ladder felt like a betrayal of her own common sense, the metal rungs slick with a grime that stained her palms. Her heart was a frantic bird trapped in her chest, hammering against her ribs with a violence that made her head swim. She thought of the diner, of the coffee she should be pouring, and the $1,400 rent she was effectively gambling away with every foot she descended. But the memory of her father, the man who never turned his back on a fire, pushed her forward into the gloom. As her feet hit the floor of the tunnel, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic, wet thud of a fist hitting flesh coming from deeper within the labyrinth. Zara killed her phone's flashlight, the darkness rushing in like a tide. She moved by touch, her fingers skimming the cold, weeping walls until a flicker of red emergency light bled into the hallway. The sound of rapid, aggressive Korean filled the space, the voices of the men casual and sharp, like they were discussing the weather rather than a man's life. Zara rounded a structural pillar, her breath hitching in her throat as the scene finally opened up before her. There, bathed in the hellish glow of a single hanging bulb, was the nightmare she had only heard from the street. Baek Do-yoon sat slumped against a central steel pillar, his physical state a testament to a long, methodical brutality. He wasn't just tied. He was professionally entombed in heavy industrial chains that wrapped around his torso, arms, and wrists, anchoring his powerful frame to the cold concrete. His white button-down shirt was a ruin of dirt and gore, the fabric clinging to skin that bloomed with dark purple bruises and fresh lacerations. Despite the blood matting his dark hair and the grime on his face, his one good eye remained open, burning with a lethal, grim focus that made Zara's knees feel weak. Zara watched from the shadows, her eyes darting to the four men in suits who stood a few yards away, their cigarettes glowing like embers in the dark. She looked at her cafe name tag, now stained with the very blood she was seeing spilled. She was a waitress from Englewood with a $1,847 bank balance, standing in the middle of a high-level execution. The absurdity of it nearly made her laugh, but the raw, labored breathing of the man in chains pulled her back to the stakes. He looked like a fallen king waiting for the final blow. Zara's hand tightened around the chunk of concrete she'd scavenged from the floor. She was crossing a line she could never uncross, trading her quiet life for a debt she couldn't possibly calculate. With a silent apology to her manager and a prayer to her father's ghost, she stepped deeper into the red light. The heavy metal door groaned on its hinges as Zara dove into the small, windowless cell, throwing the bolt home just as the shadows of the guards began to lengthen against the corridor wall. The air in the tiny room was thick with the smell of iron and sweat, vibrating with the impact of a heavy fist slamming against the outer panel. In the center of the gloom, Baek Do-yoon shifted against his restraints, the heavy industrial chains clinking like a funeral bell. His good eye fixed on Zara's bright blue uniform, a jarring splash of civilian color in his world of gray concrete and red blood. He didn't look grateful, he looked horrified. "Run," he rasped, the word tearing through a throat raw from screaming. "Get out, they will kill you." Zara didn't move toward the door. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, her fingers frantically searching the debris until they closed around a rusted, jagged piece of rebar. She looked at the man's battered face, seeing the head of operations, reduced to a broken body in a ruined white shirt. The cafe, name tag on her chest rose and fell with her panicked breathing, a tiny badge of a life that was currently slipping through her fingers. "I can't," she whispered, her voice shaking but certain. "I'm already in this." Outside, the casual conversation of the guards had vanished, replaced by urgent, sharp commands in Korean and the heavy click of handguns being readied. Through the cracks in the doorframe, Zara saw the sweep of a flashlight, a predatory beam searching for the intruder who had dared to disrupt their execution. They were coming back, and this time, they weren't going to be distracted by a falling pipe. Do-yoon's jaw tightened, a flash of something that wasn't quite pity flickering in his gaze. "You're insane," he breathed, leaning his weight forward as if to shield her even while bound to the pillar. "So I've been told," Zara replied, jamming the rebar into the concrete where the first chain was bolted. She thought of her bank balance, her $1,400 rent, and the quiet life she had lived just 20 minutes ago. It was all gone now, burned away the second she pulled that grate open. The guards slammed into the door again, the metal bending inward under the force of 4 grown men. Zara ignored the screaming in her head and threw all her weight against the rebar, the concrete beginning to spiderweb around the rusted bolt. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a lifeline, and she was the only thing standing between a mafia boss and a shallow grave. The first gunshot shattered the lock of the metal door with a deafening crack that rang through the small cell like a lightning strike. Zara screamed, instinctively ducking her head as a shower of sparks and jagged iron fragments sprayed across the floor. Behind her, the door groaned, the bolt bending under the impact, but the heavy metal remained stubbornly in place, for now. She didn't have minutes, she had seconds. Her fingers, slick with sweat and the industrial grime of the tunnel, gripped the rusted rebar with a white-knuckled desperation. She jammed the metal rod deeper into the crumbling concrete where the main bolt of Do-yoon's chains met the pillar. Again, Do-yoon commanded, his voice a low, urgent rasp that cut through the sound of boots pounding against the door. He threw his entire weight forward, the thick chains snapping taut against his bruised chest and raw wrists. Zara braced her sneakers against the floor and pulled with everything she had, her muscles screaming in protest. She thought about her $1,400 rent and the quiet, safe life she was currently destroying. She thought about her father's face as he ran toward the flames, and she realized that she was finally the woman he would have expected her to be. A second shot punched through the metal, the bullet whizzing past her ear to bury itself in the concrete wall. The impact sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her system. Zara is risking her life for a total stranger. Would you have stayed, or would you have run to work? Subscribe now to see if they make it out of that basement alive. With a final, guttural cry, Zara heaved against the rebar. The old concrete gave way with a grinding shriek of metal, the primary bolt tearing free from the pillar. One of Do-yoon's arms fell free, the heavy links clattering to the floor. He didn't waste a heartbeat, immediately reaching out with his liberated hand to grab the rebar, helping Zara wedge it into the final restraint. Together, the waitress in the stained blue uniform and the bloodied Mafia boss worked in a frantic, desperate tandem. Outside, the shooting stopped as the guards realized the door was about to fail, and the silence was far more terrifying than the noise. They were preparing for the final breach, and Zara knew that when that door opened, she wouldn't be looking at a manager with a write-up. She'd be looking at the business end of a professional execution. The metal door buckled inward under a heavy blow, the top hinge snapping with a sound like a bone breaking. Zara's eyes darted around the cramped cell, her mind racing through the logic of a woman who had spent years navigating the high-stress rushes of a diner where a single mistake could cost a shift. She saw the old industrial sprinkler head protruding from the ceiling, a relic of the building's days as a textile warehouse. Beyond the door, she heard the rapid, urgent Korean of the guards, their voices sharp with the realization that their prey was no longer alone. They were professional, but professionals didn't want a public scene. They didn't want the sirens that were sure to follow a high-profile disturbance. "Hold on to something," Zara hissed to Do-yoon, her fingers fumbling with a lighter she'd confiscated from a customer's table weeks ago. She scrambled onto a rusted crate, reaching toward the heat-sensitive bulb of the sprinkler. As another gunshot punched through the door, sending a splinter of metal into the wall beside her, Zara thumbed the lighter. The flame licked the glass, and a heartbeat later, it shattered. A roar of pressurized, stagnant water exploded into the room, a freezing black deluge that soaked her cafe name tag in seconds. Simultaneously, the building's ancient alarm system woke up, a deafening, rhythmic shriek that echoed through the maintenance tunnels and out onto the street above. Zara didn't stop there. She pulled her phone, dialed those 3 life-changing numbers, and screamed into the receiver as loud as she could. "Fire! There's a massive fire at the old Morrison Street warehouse. People are trapped." The effect was instantaneous. Through the gaps in the door, she heard the frantic retreat of boots against concrete. To a Mafia hit squad, the sound of a fire alarm was the sound of a countdown to a police perimeter. They couldn't risk being caught in a flooded basement with a bloodied boss and a witness in a waitress uniform. The shouting faded, replaced by the mechanical wail of the alarm and the splashing of water. Zara slumped against the pillar, the cold water washing the blood from her hands. They were gone for now, but as she looked at Do-yoon, whose eyes were fixed on her with a mixture of dark respect and warning, she knew she hadn't just saved a life. She had started a war. The freezing deluge from the sprinklers had turned the basement floor into a slick, black lake, and the mechanical shriek of the fire alarm felt like a physical weight against Zara's skull. She hauled Do-yoon toward the maintenance exit, his heavy frame leaning into her shoulder with a trust that felt both terrifying and sacred. They emerged into the stinging morning air 2 blocks away, finding the black Audi tucked into the shadows of a loading dock. Zara fumbled the magnetic key box from his chest, her fingers numb and trembling as she unlocked the door and shoved him into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life with a low, predatory growl that signaled a power Zara had never felt under her own feet. She didn't floor it. She couldn't afford a traffic stop. Instead, she forced herself to breathe, steering the sleek machine into the labyrinth of back alleys she had memorized over 3 years of shortcuts. Beside her, Baek Do-yoon was fading. His head lolled against the window, his breath coming in shallow, hitching rasps that rattled in his chest. Every few minutes, his eyes would flicker open, intense and dark, before the exhaustion of the torture pulled him back into the gray. "Stay with me," Zara whispered, her knuckles white on the leather steering wheel. She glanced at his wrists, where the heavy chains she hadn't yet removed clinked against the center console, a reminder of the underworld she had just invited into her life. In the distance, the wail of sirens grew louder, converging on the warehouse she had just turned into a crime scene. Zara felt the cafe name tag on her chest, soaked and ruined, and realized the life it represented was already dead. She wasn't driving toward a shift. She was driving away from her legal record, her safety, and her sanity. As she navigated the Audi through a narrow gap between two brick buildings, she caught her own reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked like her father, terrified, reckless, and entirely too far gone to turn back. The Audi's engine cut out with a final, metallic sigh in the dim shadows of the Englewood alleyway, leaving Zara in a silence so sudden it made her ears ring. She sat for a moment, her hands still fused to the steering wheel, watching the condensation from her own panicked breath cloud the windshield. Beside her, Do-yoon was a silent ghost of a man, his chin resting against his bloodied chest, the heavy chains around his wrists glinting in the pale morning light. She had done it. She had stolen a Mafia boss from the jaws of death, but as she looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes wide, uniform soaked, hair coming undone, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a casualty. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration violent against her hip. The screen lit up with a name that made her stomach drop, Rosie. Zara took a trembling breath and answered. Before she could even get a syllable out, her manager's voice tore through the speaker, sharp enough to draw blood. Rosie wasn't asking if she was okay. She was counting the minutes of a shift that had started over an hour ago. She spoke about reliability, about the one more strike policy, and about the customers who were currently waiting for coffee that Zara wasn't there to pour. "Don't bother coming in, Zara," Rosie snapped, her voice cold and final. "You're done. Pick up your final check whenever, but stay off my floor." The line went dead with a click that sounded like a gunshot. Zara stared at the black screen, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. In 5 days, she would be $1,400 short of a roof over her head. She had $1,847 in the bank, and without a paycheck, she was officially a ghost in the city's economy. She looked down at her blue uniform, the cafe name tag hanging crookedly, and realized it wasn't just a piece of plastic anymore. It was a relic of a girl who no longer existed. She reached out and touched the heavy iron links on Do-yoon's wrists, the cold metal grounding her. She had traded her stability for a stranger's heartbeat, her reputation for a criminal's survival. There was no going back to the steam of the industrial coffee maker or the polite smiles for the morning regulars. She was $400 away from the street, but as she looked at the dangerous man she had chosen to save, she knew her old life had been a small price to pay for the storm that was coming. The stairs up to her third-floor studio felt like an ascent to a gallows. Zara shouldered Do-yoon's weight, the heavy industrial chains clinking rhythmically against the metal railing, a sound that seemed loud enough to wake every neighbor in Englewood. Once inside, she kicked the door shut and engaged the deadbolt, the snap of the lock offering a fragile illusion of safety. She lowered him onto her second-hand sofa, the bright blue of her uniform clashing violently against the dark, blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. He was fully conscious now, his one good eye tracking her every move with a sharp, predatory intensity that made her hands shake as she reached for the heavy bolt cutters she'd kept in her emergency kit. The room was silent, save for the hum of her old refrigerator and Do-yoon's labored, hitching breaths. Zara knelt between his knees, the cold weight of the tool in her hands. She looked at his wrists. The metal was embedded deep into the swollen, purple flesh, and the scent of iron and antiseptic began to fill the small space. She positioned the blades of the bolt cutters against the first link. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have survived worse than a waitress with a pair of shears," Do-yoon rasped, though the grimace of pain on his face betrayed him. Zara didn't argue. She leaned her entire weight into the handles. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a bone-deep crack, the steel link snapped. Do-yoon let out a sharp, hissed breath, his body tensing into a rigid line of agony as the sudden release of pressure sent blood rushing back into his hand. Zara didn't hesitate. She moved to the second wrist. The tension in the room was a physical thing, a cord stretched to the point of breaking. As she squeezed the handles again, she looked up and caught his gaze. In that moment, the distance between the Englewood waitress and the Korean Mafia boss vanished. They were just two people bound by a choice that had cost one her job and might cost the other his life. The second chain fell to the floor with a heavy, final thud. Duyun slumped back, his hands trembling as he stared at the raw, red rings around his wrists. Zara didn't move away. She reached for her first aid kit, her fingers steadying as she began to clean the deep lacerations. She had sacrificed her livelihood for this man, and as she wiped the grime from his skin, she realized the chains weren't really gone. They had just moved from his wrists to her life. The antiseptic stung the air, sharp and clinical, as Zara worked a cotton swab over the deep gash on Duyun's cheek. He sat perfectly still on her worn sofa, the raw rings on his wrists standing out like brands against his pale skin. Now that the chains were off and the adrenaline had begun to ebb, the silence in her studio apartment felt heavy. Not with peace, but with the weight of things left unsaid. Zara looked at her own hands, still stained with the tunnel's grime and his blood, then back at the man who had turned her world into a crime scene. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "And don't tell me you're just some guy in a bad neighborhood. Those men back there, they weren't muggers." Duyun shifted, a winced intake of breath escaping his lips as his broken ribs protested. He looked around the cramped apartment, his gaze lingering on the faded photos of Zara's father and the stack of past due notices on her kitchen counter. When he finally looked back at her, the vulnerability she'd seen in the basement was gone, replaced by a cold, obsidian clarity. "My name is Baek Duyun," he said, his English precise and gravelly. "I am the head of operations for the Kim Syndicate. In your world, you would call me a ghost. In mine, I am the man who ensures the city's heart keeps beating in the dark." Zara's hand froze midair. She had heard whispers of the Kim family, shadowy figures who controlled the docks and the distribution hubs. But they were urban legends to a waitress in Englewood. To have the architect of that empire bleeding on her IKEA furniture was a reality her mind struggled to process. "You're Mafia," she whispered, the word feeling heavy and dangerous on her tongue. "I am a man who was supposed to be dead 2 hours ago," Duyun corrected her, his jaw tightening. He looked toward the window, his eyes narrowing as if he could see through the blinds to the enemies waiting in the streets. "The Choi organization didn't find me by luck. They knew my route. They knew I would be without my guard. They were waiting in that tunnel because someone I trust, someone within my own family, handed me to them on a silver platter." The betrayal seemed to hurt him more than the physical torture. He spoke of a rat in the upper echelons, a breach in the code he had spent a decade enforcing. Zara realized then that she hadn't just rescued a victim. She had intercepted a coup. "If your own people sold you out," Zara said, the math of their situation becoming terrifyingly clear, "then they're not just looking for you. They're looking for anyone who might help you. They're looking for me." Duyun didn't deny it. He reached out, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he brushed the edge of her cafe name tag, still pinned to her ruined uniform. "I told you to run, Zara. You chose to stay. Now, the people who betrayed me will see you as a witness, and the people who still follow me will see you as a liability." He leaned back, his eyes dark with a warning that made the small apartment feel like a cage. "You saved my life, but you also ended yours. From the moment you pulled that grate open, you stopped being a waitress and started being a target." The heavy silence of the apartment was shattered by a low, rhythmic thumping at the door. Not the frantic pounding of the Choi assassins, but a measured, authoritative knock that vibrated through the floorboards. Zara's breath hitched, her hand flying to the handle of the bolt cutters as she stood protectively in front of the sofa. She looked at Duyun, expecting to see fear, but he had straightened his posture, his eyes hardening into flint. He gave a sharp, single nod. "Open it," he commanded. "They are mine." Zara's fingers trembled as she threw the deadbolt. The door swung open to reveal a wall of black suits. 3 men stood in the narrow hallway, their presence turning her cramped studio into a claustrophobic cage. The man in the lead, older with silvering temples and eyes like tempered steel, stepped inside and stopped dead. He took in the sight of his bloodied boss, the waitress in the stained blue uniform, and the heavy chains lying discarded on the floor. "Boss," the man whispered in Korean, a mixture of shame and relief flooding his features. He moved to kneel, but Duyun raised a hand, stopping him mid-motion. "Save the apologies for later, Duyun rasped, his voice regaining the cold weight of a king back on his throne. "The rats in our own house are the priority now." Duyun turned his gaze toward Zara. It was a cold, predatory look, the look of a man who viewed civilians as loose ends to be tucked away. Zara felt the cafe name tag on her chest grow heavy. She was a witness. She was the girl who knew too much. She saw the subtle shift in Duyung's hand, moving toward the inside of his jacket, and she felt the ghost of her father's bravery flare one last time in her chest. She didn't flinch. "Wait." Diyun's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He stood up slowly, leaning on the back of the sofa for support, but his eyes never left his men. He pointed a bruised, trembling finger toward Zara. "This woman pulled me from the dark when my own blood left me to rot," Diyun declared, his voice echoing in the small room. "She lost her livelihood to keep my heart beating. She is no longer a stranger. She is no longer a witness." He stepped toward Zara, closing the distance until the scent of iron and expensive cologne overwhelmed her. He looked at Diyun and the guards behind him with a terrifying finality. "From this moment, Zara Banks is Curé, under my personal protection. To touch her is to touch me. To threaten her is to declare war on the Kim family. She is untouchable." The guards bowed in unison, a silent, chilling acknowledgement of her new status. Zara looked around her apartment, at the unpaid bills, the cheap furniture, and her ruined uniform. The life she had known, a life of counting tips and dodging eviction, was gone. She had saved a man who was much worse than a gang member, and in return, he had woven her into the dangerous tapestry of his world. Diyun turned back to her, a ghost of a smile touching his split lips. "You told me you weren't a charity case, Zara. You were right. You are a debt of honor. And as I told you, I always pay my debts." Zara watched as they began to usher her out, leaving the studio behind. She had run toward the fire, just like her father, and now she would have to learn to live in the heat. Zara is no longer just a waitress. She's a Mafia debt of honor. Comment Part 2 if you want to see her first mission in the underworld, and don't forget to subscribe and follow for the next chapter.